and that you're implementing your procedures for this. It's more than just having it in writing. It's making sure that you have the written methodology for ensuring that the income earned as a result of the Ryan White program is being reinvested back into that program and not used for other agency purposes. And program income allows programs to expand service delivery supported by a grant and to fill gaps in their care continuum. And this goes back to the intent of the 340B program to stretch scarce federal resources and provide more care to more patients. For Ryan White, the service categories that a program uses program income for don't need to be the services that that they are funded for under the grant. They need to be allowable service categories under Ryan White. And some examples of that are like dental clinic, behavioral health services, housing, transportation services, even if a program is not funded for those things under their particular award. If they're allowable Ryan White services and there's a gap in the care continuum and those services address that, they can be considered allowable. And program income is considered additive, which means it expands the budget of the program. And to the extent available, Ryan White recipients should spend their program income earned as a result of the program before requesting additional cash payments for the grant, and based on their grant cycle. So program income earned or could be earned in a different performance period than it's received. So in this case, the guidelines are that the program income should be spent in the performance period it's received. So for parts C and D, which have multi-year performance periods, 3 to 5 years, they have a bit more room and time to spend the program income. This is as opposed to parts A and B with a 1-year performance period. The program income received within that period should also be obligated or spent within that period. And so that requires a good methodology for making sure that as income is earned, it's being reallocated back into the service categories and being tracked and connected with accounting and billing departments. So as I said, program income is additive, and which means that it's added to the grant funds that are already committed to the program and used to further the program objectives. So program income expands the budget for program activities. It's not deducted from the total amount of the grant funds. And it's helpful to consider program income and grant funds as the total budget, so that when when a program is obligating expenses at the end of the performance period, they don't have large amounts of unobligated expenses. And this means, of course, that program income should be spent on costs that are allowable under the award. And for Ryan White Parts A, B, and C, these are some of the allowable expenditures that program income can be spent on, including core medical services, support services, clinical quality management, and administrative expenses. For Part D, the allowable costs are family-centered care, support services, CQM, other administrative expenses. And for Part F, the allowable expenses are based on the statutory provisions. So that could be SPINS or ATC or a dental program. It just depends on what your program is funded for. So for recipients are required to report their program income. So that means tracking and reporting all the program income earned and expended, and demonstrating that the expenditures are within the allowable service costs for the program. On a federal financial report, the program income earned is a separate amount than spent. So program income earned is reported on line L, and program income expended is reported on line N. And this should also be tracked by the funding stream. So if you receive multiple Ryan White awards, those should all be documented as well. Recipients are also required to monitor their subrecipients' use of program income. So whether that's part of routine subrecipient monitoring, recipients should be able to track the program income earned and expended by their subrecipients as well, although that's not reported on the recipient's FFR. So for subrecipients, they are also required to reinvest their program income earned from their program back into the allowable expenses for Ryan White and report that to their recipient. And as I said, this is not reported on the recipient's federal financial report. And program income can be used to support allowable activities in excess of the caps that are imposed by Ryan White for the grant funds. Some examples of that are administrative costs, which are capped at 10%, clinical quality management, indirect costs. Program income can support those activities or expenditures in excess of those caps. The exception to that is the executive level 2 salary cap. Program income is not exempt from that. And so in terms of tracking program income, keeping monthly reports of payments received for 340B is a good practice for making projections and budgeting so that you can prevent having large amounts of unobligated, unused expenses at the end of the performance period. We see programs that aren't able to react to the amount of program income they're receiving from 340B because they're not routinely tracking payments received and adding that to their program budget. So in some cases, they're left at the end of the year with a large amount of money that they need to obligate. And so keeping track of this monthly allows your program to project and plan ahead for how you're going to expand services and allocate money throughout the performance period. So the general rule for that is that greater frequency of tracking and reporting equals better accuracy and gives the program more time to adjust the budget and their activities. So when it comes to spending program income, we also work with a lot of agencies that struggle with spending grant funds and program income because they're focusing on spending program income before grant funds. And this is the guidance, and sometimes that can be misleading. So, we've seen that at the end of a performance period, a program could have almost all of their grant funds unobligated because they were spending program income first. And this can cause some anxiety for a program who realizes that they have all this new income and it's causing them to expand really quickly, and that can be hard to keep up with. So a recommendation is to allocate program income and grant funds to separate expenditures, and that way funds can be spent simultaneously. And an example of that is if a program has a provider that's completely funded by grant funds and they see that there's a need for an additional provider, they can use program income to hire another provider. So now that program has doubled its services in that area. Some best practices for managing a 340B program in terms of a Ryan White setting is to show that your program is budgeting program income to avoid unobligated funds and showing how you're using it. So developing a plan to spend program income and have that written. Budget program income to complement the services directly funded to the grant. So again, understanding that the program income and grant funds together make your total budget, and to think of it that way. And also just to consider the gaps in the care continuum in your jurisdiction and to direct funds to services that may increase retention and care or fill a certain need, as long as it's an allowable expenditure. That's usually a best practice for how to consider tracking, budgeting, reporting, and utilizing program income. And we get a lot of questions about some of the allowable expenses for program income. We've gotten a lot of questions from Ryan White recipients who would like to use or leverage that program to fund PrEP especially. That's not an allowable expense under Ryan White, but NOTA will be able to talk a little bit more about how SPD clinics can leverage their programs and 340B to be able to expand that service to their constituents and make sure that they're compliant. So, Nota, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much.